to MFA Writers. I'm so glad to have you here. Today we have a special episode with the wonderful professor and memoirist Deborah Jackson Taffa. I am really excited for you all to hear this episode. But before that, I wanted to send a quick thank you to a few listeners who recently donated to the podcast on buymeacoffee.com/MFA Writers. A big thank you to D, Hillary Powers, and Nikolai C., who recently sent a few coffees our way. I'm so glad that you all have found the podcast entertaining and useful, and I'm super grateful that you all were willing to support us. Thank you so much. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/MFA Writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today we've got a special faculty episode with Deborah Jackson Taffa, a citizen of the Quitsan Yuma Nation in Laguna Pueblo. Deborah is the director of the MFA in Creative Writing program at the Institute for American Indian Arts, and she earned her own MFA at the University of Iowa. Her writing can be found at PBS, Salon, LARB, Brevity, A Public Space, The Boston Review, The Rumpus, and the Best American Non-Required Reading. In late 2021, she was named a MacDowell Fellow, Kranzberg Arts Fellow, and Tin House Scholar. In 2022, she won a PEN American Grant for Oral History and was named a Hedgebrook Fellow. Today, Deborah has brought an excerpt from her memoir, Whiskey Tender, to read for us.
Thank you for having me. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, a chapter that is titled The Price is Right. When my parents left their wedding reception, Mom was sober. Dad, of course, drove. He sped toward 4th Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Yuma, cutting into the opposite lane on corners, fishtailing with a groom's finesse. Mom grew scared. She hiked up her wedding dress, reached her long leg over his thigh, and stomped the brake with her high-heel shoe. The tires locked up. The car swung wide to the right before spinning them all the way around to the left, showing them the surprised expressions of people in other cars. It was like we were riding on the tilt-a-wheel at the Yuma County Fair, Mom said. The car slammed into the side of a busy downtown bar. The Plymouth's front end was mangled. Steam poured out of the radiator. It was a Sunday afternoon in April 1963, and the day was still light. Afternoon drinkers came flowing out of the bar's smoky interior like rice throwers out of a cathedral in a haze of incense and prayer. Being the eldest of 15 kids had made Mom conspicuous in this small town, and the bar was her father Juan's favorite, so some of the regulars and barflies realized she was a Herrera girl and wanted to know if she was okay. Sirens started up in the distance. A couple of biker chicks helped Mom out of the car, and she stood with them on the sidewalk in front, staring at the damaged headlight and hood. In her hurry to get out, she'd caught the train of her wedding dress in the door, and it had ripped. When she saw the torn fabric, she started crying. She told us, "I could see your dad through the window of the car with his forehead rested on the wheel, and I knew exactly what he was thinking." Dad was from the Yuma Reservation, across the train tracks and river, and he was worried the town cops were going to book him again. But when the cops pulled up at the accident scene and looked at Mom, plopped on the curb in a puff of white satin, mascara running down her cheeks, they decided to be merciful and let Dad go. Mom said they felt sorry for her because she was a good local Catholic girl who'd married a crazy Indian. When Dad walked in the front door and heard her telling us the story, he laughed and said she was wrong. He said the cops let him go not because they pitied her, but because Mom was beautiful and pretty people got away with shit. He pulled off his black boots and lifted his holy socks onto the coffee table. He put his arm around her and said getting away scot-free on their wedding day was the first sign Mom's charm would work magic in his life, like a lucky rabbit's foot or a powerful tattoo. He reminded Mom how romantic he'd been at their wedding, how he'd refused to let her sisters decorate the car with do-it-yourself flowers because the phony tissue paper looked too common for a woman of her caliber. Instead, he and his brothers had performed a top-secret midnight operation, sneaking into St. Thomas Indian Mission's garden on the reservation, where they cut a bunch of roses to string over the roof of the car. Mom groaned, "Don't brag about stealing from the church," but the two of them laughed, and Dad went in the kitchen to grab a snack. Mom's protestations never fooled me. She loved the memory of the stolen roses, as well as Dad's claim that her beauty swayed the cops. But what made her light up especially was the way he called her his lucky charm. This is how my parents twisted bad things around, seeing the appearances of events in funhouse mirrors, stretching memories tall and pretty when they were really goofy and squat. They knew a story could be told in various ways, and this is how they chose to shape theirs, and how they would teach me to shape mine as well, by molding their wedding day car accident into their first blessing as a couple.
Deborah, that's a great excerpt. Thanks for sharing that with us, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's fun to read that piece. It's one of the stories that I heard in my childhood that I always loved.
Yeah, I bet the process of writing this book, you're just constantly returning to those random memories like that and mining them for material, yeah?
Yeah, it's a combination, I think. Memoir writing is a combination of memory, artifact, interview, research, and then supposition plays a big role, right? Like family mysteries, family secrets that you are trying to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, but was there anything about this process that surprised you, writing this book?
I think how long it took.
Yeah.
I saw other people write nonfiction books that are a little more distant from them.
Uh-huh.
It was a topic that they had randomly picked from society,
Right.
The murder of a filmographer or something that didn't feel as close. I think sort of the ethical circles that I went in, kind of circling what was okay to tell, what felt like it might not be fair to tell, why I was telling, and how I would shape it contextually. That was way more than I bargained for.
You say in the book that Native memoirs are rare because there are rules on Indian reservations, and you say that stems from certain fears and disagreements about what should or shouldn't be said outside the reservation. I'm curious to hear if you felt any fear or hesitancy about telling this story, and what message you have for other Native writers who may be feeling hesitant to tell those stories.
I felt definitely fears about telling this story. I feel like there are two factors in the idea that it's taboo to write a memoir when you're Native. And one is that we approach identity oftentimes by saying, I'm Deborah Taffa. I come from the Jackson clan on the Fort Yuma Indian Reservation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the Keepers of the Water clan. My grandfather was, my uncle is, my family. You kind of introduce everybody before you. And then on the other side, I'm Badger, Big Badger, Little Corn clan from Laguna Pueblo, the Antonio family. You always put yourself behind a group of people, and you're taught to really kind of listen to your elders and to not assume that role of being an elder, not to think of yourself necessarily as somebody who should be speaking, but you should always be taught to be listening as a child, is kind of the way that it is. And then the other thing is that I think that in Native culture, it's not a surprise to say that a lot has been taken from us, our land, our culture, our traditions, our languages. And so in some ways, a lot of people feel like the stories that we have and the things that happened in privacy behind, closed doors, that's kind of the last of what we kind of can hold on to. And there's difficulty in trusting mainstream society to kind of overhear us. And that's really what happens when you write a memoir like this. I can think intensely about how I'm writing this memoir for Native children and for my own Native grandchildren. But it's like being at a coffee table in a coffee shop, and you're kind of telling stories to your best friend who you really trust across the table. And then you become aware that the tables around you are kind of listening in and eavesdropping.
Yeah.
You have to be okay with the fact that people that you did not, the point of telling the people that you did not write this for, they're also going to be listening in. And I think that's where the ethical sort of considerations start to really become very rich and complicated, because you start to wonder about representations and portrayal and why you're doing what you're doing. And I think advice that I would give to other Native writers, I mean, it's very old advice. It's basically, by putting into context everything that has happened to my family through the generations, I am in some ways exposing hidden histories, but also it's an indictment of the U.S. government and what they have done to us. And I it's worse to forget. In the end, I came up with that sort of, I'm getting older, and it would be a terrible thing for all of these memories to be lost. It's important for everyone to hear this story. It's a uniquely American story.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this really great line early in the book where you write, "Tell me your favorite childhood memory and I'll tell you who you are." I think it's a beautiful and powerful statement. And I feel like it sums up at least one mission of writing memoir, to explore the past in an effort to understand the present. So what did you hope to learn about yourself, your community, and or the country from writing this book?
Yeah. It's embarrassing to feel that you don't have self-awareness. When somebody points out, say you're very intimate with someone and they point out something about you that you've never seen about yourself before, and you think, oh, how horrible that I have this sort of cognitive dissonance, that I have this obvious character trait. So for me, memoir is this wonderful way of uncovering deeper truths about how I came to be the adult that I am in the world today, how I came to be an artist and a writer, and what sort of family I have been to my siblings and my father and my mother. And, on a larger scale, it's really interesting when you travel internationally and people are always curious, like, what is happening in the United States? Why do people not see the history of the United States very clearly when the rest of the world does? Like, look at what has happened in this period of history, that period of history, and why do Americans deny it? It's sort of the same thing. It's like, well, I'm writing this memoir that is in some ways a political memoir, because an indigenous identity is always political. We were enemies, the first enemies of the U.S., the first foreign enemies of the U.S. All of our foreign policy was written around how to deal with the Native problem, as they called it. I really hope that in the same way that this memoir has made me see myself more clearly and my family more clearly, that the book can help Americans who are interested in a new definition of what it means to be American, to kind of see their own history more clearly, because that's how you grow up. You grow up by putting to bed the sort of blind spots that you have about your own character. As individual people and as a country, we need that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember myself, I lived abroad for a long time, and I would get questions like that all the time. People would come up to me and ask me to speak for my country, which is it's a lot of pressure, right?
Yeah.
So this is a great book for a number of reasons. One is to develop a better understanding of that history so that you can answer those questions when you get called to answer those questions. Because even if you don't travel abroad, there's going to be a moment in your life where you need to speak up and answer for these things. And having a clearer understanding of them, a more nuanced understanding of them, is invaluable.
Yeah. One of the things that's so important to me in the book is showing there are so many ways that my elders and Native people have contributed to national security, the building of America, and it's not remembered, and it's not, the land that was sacrificed for Americans to have a home to live. There's so much history that is just not taught in school and that people are not aware of. And I wanted to make sure, though, that I didn't write something that was a dry nonfiction book, but that it was hung on sort of a humorous and poignant personal narrative, because I'm really aware of the sort of need to entertain people. If people are not entertained, they're not going to take in the history.
You mentioned earlier the idea of this being an American story. I saw one review called it a quintessentially American story. And you read from that one excerpt, that one chapter that's called The Price is Right. There's stories about Little Debbie snack cakes in here, things like that, alongside stories from your childhood, split between the Quetzal Nation and Navajo territories, the consequences of broken treaties and forced assimilation. So how important was it to you to capture this reality that Native people are not just one thing or the other, but a mosaic of cultures and histories like any other people?
Yes. When you're in an MFA program, everyone always tells you to make rich, complicated characters. And, we have these very intersectional identities in the world today. And I wanted to make sure to include the complexities, in my identity as I created this narrative, because it's who I am. At the same time that it does feel like, in some ways, in order to get a story kind of contained in a way that doesn't feel too digressive, that you ultimately have to flatten yourself into a persona on the page that is a two-dimensional representation of you. So there are certainly aspects of who I am as an adult, right, that are, multilingual and well-traveled, that I couldn't shove into this narrative. And so when I first went to Iowa and I first started crafting this narrative, I imagined that the scope would be much broader than just my childhood. It wouldn't just be a coming-of-age story. I was determined to show people, that I had traveled in Indonesia and been in West Africa, and that I had malaria, and that all of these other things happened, because you don't want to feel that you have become a character that is too limited. But ultimately, it was too broad a scope for me to say everything. I just realized at a certain point that what I really wanted to do and what I really needed to do, and it felt like a responsibility perhaps even, was to write what I would call like the quintessential coming of age story of a young Native girl in the 1980s, which does not exist on any bookshelves. It's like I couldn't find it anywhere in the world. And so, I guess it feels complex to me. And another thing about complexity is that I feel like the ideas and the questions that I'm sort of bringing to the forefront in the book, for me, they're very complicated, and there's no easy answer to some of those questions. But the language itself, I wanted to feel, I worked really hard to make the language simple, to make it flow, to make the story feel like it was easy, like it was a quick read, somehow that the language had a lyric quality that you get into the book and you flow through it. And that simplicity is hard to come by. When I first started writing, my writing was really dense and digressive and just trying to shove a lot in there. And, at a certain point I thought, well, if I want this to be commercial, I need to find a way to make it sing a little more smoothly. So,
yeah. How long have you been working on this book?
It's been a long time. I would say that, there are some images and events, single day events, that I probably wrote 15 years ago, just kind of scribbling on the back of envelopes. And then I would transfer it over to Word documents. And I had many Word documents, and then that computer would die and I would put them on a flash drive and push it to the next computer. But I really didn't start working on it in earnest until I went to Iowa. I went there in the fall of 2010. And then I got an offer for publication in 2018. But by then I had an agent who was like, this is written as an essay collection. I think that if we revised it towards a memoir with a narrative arc, you might get a broader audience. And so I figured I had nothing to lose. I had the essay collection saved on my computer. I went in and I started redrafting in the direction of a memoir. And ultimately, I liked what it became going that route.
Well, I feel like I should mention we're doing this interview on February 26th, and your memoir officially releases tomorrow, February 27th. That's my understanding. So yes. It's been a long process. Congratulations. It must feel, I don't know, kind of surreal to be at this moment.
It's a really, it's kind of in some ways, it's a little bit anticlimactic in a weird way because, I don't know, I've talked to people who are like, oh, my book is coming out, and I keep going back in and looking and wishing I could change this or I could change that. And I don't feel any of that. I think I was very stubborn and I waited a very long time. I didn't want to hand it off to an editor and then have the editor shape it in a direction I didn't want it to be taken. So I held it very close to my heart, probably longer than I should have. And I reworked it many, many times. So that at this point, it feels like I feel satisfied with what it is. And I feel like maybe it's going to be time to move on to the next project. And I feel good about it.
Well, that's great. I can't wait for people to read it because it really is a beautiful story. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading it was how important place is in this memoir. I mean, I think it's like hard to overstate how important place is in this. You write a lot about your grandmother in the book and how she instilled in you the importance of developing a deep connection to your homeland through storied histories, sensory experiences, and a deep caring for that place. I was hoping you could tell us a bit about your grandmother, her devotion to the land, and how it influenced your writing of this book.
Oh gosh, that's a deep question. I feel like the land for my grandmother and for people in her generation, it was a sacred thing. They didn't want to leave their homeland. We have become much more itinerant and kind of, mobile in contemporary times. But for them, it was a type of soul death to leave the area between their sacred mountains. And, I think that it's easy to abuse the land if you are a guest in somebody else's country. If you love it very deeply, there's a caring that goes into it, and there's a memory that goes into it. And then there's a power in the stories and the myths that come out of it. My grandmother and my great-grandmother, my grandmother Esther died when I was very young. And so my memories of her are like this very gentle presence, but she was gone too soon. Because she grew up near the open pit uranium mines at Laguna. She developed a very rare form of sinus cancer. And my father was saying that it could have also been from her working in the laundromat. There are no environmental markers for why people get cancers, obviously. But, and then my great grandmother, she lived until her 90s, so I could see her around. But I guess what I'm saying is that, there's a generation of female Native writers who are older than me, Louise Erdrich, Leslie Marmon-Silko, and their books have this flavor of the land that is quasi-mythical and really, really beautiful, but it feels like a little older world than what I'm writing. And then we have younger writers who are coming out of like the millennial generation. But people who grew up and were born in the era that I was born in 1969, we haven't had a chance necessarily to tell our stories. And that means the stories that we learned from our grandparents also have been kind of silent. So my granny was born in the late 1800s. And if you remember that Geronimo was not captured until 1887, she was just standing right on the cusp of this new America. And when I look for her in the old BIA Dawes rolls, as a little kid, they always say that she was roaming, which meant that she didn't have a permanent home because the Shoshone Paiute were always moving around on the plains, kind of later than a lot of other tribes. And so, they were unfathomable to me. Like I had a childhood that was outdoors. I stayed outside a lot. And when you think about the generational change, though, between my great granny who was roaming and my kids who, kids nowadays, they grow up kind of inside. There's a big transition there. And the desert for me is, it's just a beautiful, sacred place that I love to be in. It's very healing for me. But I can't say that it's unique in that. Like, I find beauty in the earth everywhere I go. I think that my grandparents and my great-grandparents were just they had just a different worldview when it came to the land. I can't imagine being so attached to a particular valley that I didn't want to leave it.
Right.
I like travel. I hope that answers your question. That's a hard one.
Yeah, it is a hard question. It's hard to imagine just because, like you said, the changes in just one or two generations. It's hard not to feel removed from that way of life and removed from that worldview. But I imagine in writing the memoir, you probably had a chance to kind of try to sit in that space a little bit more and try to understand it a little bit more maybe than before.
I feel it when I go out in the land a lot. I walk every day. I hike a lot. I like to downhill ski. I canoe long distances on rivers. It's my mode of being in the world. And I feel it when I'm out in the land. I feel a connection. I guess what I'm saying is that when there are limits. You have limits as a memoirist, and it's like trying to have the empathy to imagine the life of a grandparent or a great-grandparent that came from another era that was so profoundly different than yours is a challenge. I know, though, that I'm connected to this land here in a very deep and very meaningful way, and not only through the plants themselves. I mean, I wrote in the book about going to the Native American church and partaking in grandfather peyote, and the connection that I feel with the desert is very deep and extends to the power plants that grow there. And it's very healing, and it's very important to me, even as I recognize that I'm a contemporary, modern person like everybody else who travels everywhere. I think everyone has that connection to some place, and I hope it inspires people to think about where that connection is for them. Ultimately, I think the farm to table movement, people having gardens in their backyard, all of that represents sort of a longing to connect with a land that feels sacred. And if you stretch back far enough in anyone's ancestral history, you find the generation that had that connection. It just so happens that for me, it was very recent. Some people have to go back further, hundreds of years maybe to find it, but it's there. And once you know it's there and you go to that place, the land remembers you. There's sort of a DNA in you and in the land that matches. And I believe that to be true.
Yeah, that was a really poignant part of the book, I thought, when you talk about that idea that, like, even if you're away, when you go back, the land doesn't forget you. Because when you started writing this book, like you said, you were in the Midwest, you were in Iowa, and then you lived in Missouri, but you finished the book in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is much closer to where you grew up. So in what ways did writing about that place from a distance affect the writing, either positively or negatively? And how important was it for you to go back there?
Oh, yeah. I think that initially I had to be away in order to write this book. I will say that always. And I think that leaving the Southwest for a period of time was something that I needed to do to survive, like to grow intellectually, but also it infused the narrative with a kind of love and nostalgia and distance that I could not have achieved if I had been there. In some ways, you really, as a memoirist, you have to kind of be able to back up from the narrative and bring some objectivity to it, right? So early drafts, a lot of times, wallow in the sadness or wallow in the grief or whatever is happening in the narrative. You're too close to see it. So being in Missouri and only coming back sporadically to visit my parents in the Four Corners or to go back to the reservation only sporadically, it really gave me room to imagine it. But then when I got back to Santa Fe and I was on campus at the Institute of American Indian Arts, I had all of these stories that were stories of family lore that my father had told me, or I last lived on the reservation when I was 30. That was when I moved away. And so my grandfather's sisters were still alive, and I would sit on their front porch and talk to them and think about what they were telling me and go home and take notes, because I always knew that I wanted to write something. And I would listen to these stories, but I didn't have any sort of documented evidence. So after I sold the book to Harper and we were in that final year of editing, the book was very much straight up a memoir. It had less history in it. It would mention little things that I had heard, like the first solid house that my father lived in, they picked up in San Diego. I knew that. But then suddenly, because the IAIA library has a lot of books, from Native country, research I could do that I couldn't do anywhere else kind of became a part of my life. And I went in and I found evidence. I could support the stories that my dad, I found entire chapters on my grandfather, for example, in some of the books. And that was incredible for me because it was like taking all of the things that I knew had happened, but then finding all of the specific facts related to that event in the library. It was like a backwards process. And so I'm really grateful. It feels in some ways like I ended up at IAIA at the perfect moment in the book's life to fill it out and to kind of more confidently round the corner of the final draft. It's incredible.
Well, let's talk about IAIA a bit. You work as the director of the MFA in Creative Writing program at the Institute for American Indian Arts, which is a 2-year low residency program with tracks in poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, and screenwriting, according to the website.
That's correct.
How long have you been serving as the director of this program, and what drew you to this role besides having the chance to get back to Santa Fe?
I saw the program. It was founded when I was in Iowa City in 2012. So there I was entering my final year of the MFA program, and I saw that Sherman Alexie and John Davis had started this incredible MFA program where they were going to be Native writers. And it was like, I was so torn because I thought maybe I should jump from Iowa and go to Santa Fe because, when you're in workshops at an MFA program and people don't understand your cultural background, sometimes your workshop sessions feel like they are kind of spinning in place a little bit as you explain basic tenets of the culture. So I always loved the idea of IAIA, but I finished at Iowa and I was writing and I had my eye on it and I had it, I had followed it in my social media feeds. So the pandemic hit, and when the pandemic hit, I came to Hawaii because my oldest daughter was pregnant and her husband was deployed in the Air Force, and she wanted somebody, and I was teaching online for Washington University in St. Louis and Webster University in St. Louis as an adjunct. So I came out here. And in that year, I was again immersed in a Native culture. I met a lot of Native Hawaiians who are her family. And when the pandemic ended, or it was nearing the end, I don't know if it's even over, but, after about a year and a half, I went back to St. Louis. And as soon as I got back, I had this really strong feeling that I didn't belong there anymore. I think we had lost enough tribal members and loved ones during the pandemic that moment, that inevitable moment arrived when I thought, it's time to go home. I can feel that my land is calling me back. My people are calling me back. And so I just told everyone in my family, I was like, I think it's time to go home. And about 2 days later, I'm not kidding you, I saw come through my Twitter feed the announcement that IAIA needed a new director of their MFA program. And as soon as I saw it come through my feed, I just knew. I was like, that's my job. They're going to hire me. So I put together a resume very quickly. I sent it in. They interviewed me within a week, and I had the job offer probably within a month. It all happened very quickly. And I've been there now for almost 3 years.
Wow. That's a really amazing story.
It's very odd. Everything happened. That's what I'm saying. Like, everything happened exactly the way it makes me feel like my ancestors were watching out for me.
Yeah.
And it ultimately makes me feel like this book is a good thing that I've done, though I'm prepared for whatever comes on the road. It's like, and within the family, my father has read it. My siblings have not. They all have it on order. They should be getting it in the next few days. And we'll have discussions about the ways in which they agree or disagree with my take on our history. It's inevitable when you write memoir that will happen.
So what advice do you have for memoirists who are listening and maybe worried about those conversations? Like, how do you approach them? How do you think about them?
Yeah, I think that for me, one of the things I thought about a lot was, if I'm going to reveal something about my father or my sister or my mother, I have to make sure that I'm revealing more, even making myself even more vulnerable, telling stories that feel that they are very personal and frightening to share. The other thing is that, the sort of context, like understanding historically the societal pressures that affected all of us and made us make decisions that the decisions that we did. A good memoir tells people what happened, and a great memoir tells people what happened and how societal forces kind of shaped that happening. And I think it was really important to me to both kind of pull in really close and show and make people feel sort of the visceral details of that world that I was portraying, right? But then I also wanted to kind of zoom out and show the wide angle lens shot of the United States and what was going on in the United States in that era and why this was happening and what they were responding to, people in my family. That felt very important because then I think that there's a reason for the telling. And I would tell people who are writing memoir that, you don't have to show people what you're writing in the beginning. You can't put limits on yourself in terms of what you're telling on the page. It's on your computer. It's a long way from becoming something that's public. And even when it becomes public, how many people will actually read it? I think what matters is that you really focus on what feels like an honest exploration to you. And you can worry about what you want to publish and what you don't want to publish at a later phase. That's not really what it's about.
So keep the drafting process as like a place of low stakes, low pressure. None of this has to be out in the world ever. But what's important is in those early pages, just be honest and tell it exactly how it happened.
Yes, I think so. And, the thing is that it'll start to shift as well under your gaze. I mean, it's very easy for your story to change the more that you think about it. You can be, for example, one thing that I thought a lot as a child was like my mother and I were not very close, and she was much closer with some of my other sisters. And I really lamented that fact. And then as I got older, I realized how in some ways having a mother that I wasn't close to made me stand on my own 2 feet and become much more independent than some of my siblings did, who had more of a sort of a really close relationship with her that maybe prevented them from leaving the reservation or leaving home. They didn't spread their wings quite as much, So you start to kind of see things in new relief. So those early drafts ultimately shift and change, but you can't see them clearly until you have them on the page and there's something that's separate from you, and they sit for a couple of weeks or a month, or in my case, months. And then you go back and you look at them and you realize, oh, well, here, maybe I'm being a little dishonest with myself. And then, you keep revising it. And ultimately, it comes to a place of grace. You cannot write characters that you try to crown with a halo, and you cannot write black cats. That's just not who people are. But in the beginning, a lot of times they come out one way or the other. And then with time, you start to fully round them out.
Well, I can tell you're a great teacher. Your students are very lucky to have you in that program. Let's go back to talking about the MFA program at IAIA. On the website, it says, we emphasize the importance of Native writers offering voice to the Native experience. The program and the literature we read carries a distinct Native American and First Nations emphasis. However, you also told me before the interview that this program is not just for Native students, that you seek to advance alternative perspectives from both Natives and allies alike. Could you talk a bit about the program's goals and why you think the promotion of these alternative perspectives is important?
Yeah, I think just to state it simply, I think that if, a long time ago, if people had listened a little bit to the wisdom and the science and the botany and the philosophy and the theology of Native people, we might not be in the situation that we're in today. I think that a balance between, you travel to a foreign place, you listen to what the locals believe, you ask yourself questions, perhaps you adopt some of their value system for your own. Instead, in the United States, I feel like Native wisdom was treated like it was superstition. Native wisdom was treated like it was worthless, and it was squelched. And, the codexes in South America were burned, and so much has been forgotten of that old wisdom, And so, at IAIA, I'm in a very unique situation where the president, Dr. Martin, is Cherokee, and the provost, Felipe Colon, is Laguna Pueblo, and the academic dean, everyone is Native. And you walk down the hall, and there's this incredible combination of academic scholars and traditional people. So, a woman who's right next to me, who's like the dean's assistant, her grandfather was the first Hopi man to attend Harvard, and she's back home at Second Mesa all the time for these traditional ceremonies that they do. It's a very unique world, and 70% of the books that our students read are indigenous, right? So, but we define indigenous in the program as a worldwide definition. So that might be people from Australia, people from New Zealand, poets from all over the world, from Africa, anywhere where there's a closeness to the land. So ultimately, the non-Native people that we draw to the program are people who are working from a perspective that is sort of marginalized or misunderstood, or, like I said when I spoke with you before, people that are looking for a new, more broad definition, perhaps, of what it means to be American. Ultimately, I think we want to be proud of what it means to be United. It's hard to be a United States citizen when you look at what's happening in the world. And, it would be horrific for people in other countries to look. And it's happened to me when I've traveled, where people say, "Where are you from?" And I say, "I'm from the United States." And they make assumptions about my identity based on my nationality. And I have to try to explain to them that actually it's different than what they perceive. Well, the fact that I have to explain to people that there are Americans that don't believe in sort of this imperialist or colonizing approach to the world is a problem. We want to change people's idea of who we are, and it's only going to happen if people are allowed to speak. So I have a student right now, a very talented student in the creative nonfiction field, who's from India, and she had polio as a child, so she's handicapped. And I have an environmental writer who lives in Alaska, who is a white colonizer, she calls herself, but she's writing in an environmental thread. So when I look at applications, it's not like I'm looking only at, are you tribally affiliated? Can you prove that you're a descendant? It's kind of like a portion of our community comes in, and they're anti-racist allies, and they know that they're going to thrive under the tutelage of the Native teachers that we have working in the program, and I support them.
You've mentioned a couple times your time at Iowa, where you got your MFA degree. You told me before the interview that you were a non-traditional student, a first-generation high school, college, and higher ed graduate in your family. I'm curious to hear you talk about, you've mentioned how there were times at Iowa where you felt like you were spinning your wheels a little bit because you had to explain your culture to people. I imagine that being a non-traditional student, a first-generation student, had its own challenges. I'm curious to hear what you learned from that experience at Iowa that you are now applying to this program in Santa Fe.
That's a really wonderful thing. People go into Iowa feeling like they're going to be famous like in a year. So it's a highly competitive program where there's quite a bit of ego, as you can imagine. And I am not a person that thrives on competition. I just don't. It's very difficult for me. Even when it comes to sports, I would rather go out for a run by myself I like to compete with myself. And so, but you see people succeed coming out of there, and some of them kind of come out of the gates really fast, and everybody's kind of intent on I was asked by a lot of people that I knew, like, why are you waiting so long? And one thing that it taught me was that, and I tell my students all the time, is that, feeling some envy of writing that's really good and people that who are publishing to great acclaim is relatively normal. It's what we all experience. And you experience it in workshop when somebody brings a story that is some kick-ass story that you're like, wow, that's amazing. I could never do that. That's not my style of writing. That's not my people. That's not, and I realized that, if you praise it immediately, you affirm your love of the art form. And that's what people are at an MFA. That's the one thing that you have in common with people if you go to an MFA program like IAIA, where you're the only Native person, is that you're there because you love literature and you love art. And so does everybody else. And so, the intellectual engagement and the conversations that were had, I always tried to praise other people's work as soon as I knew that I valued it, thinking, this is a wonderful book and why would I not support it? At the same time that when I received criticism that felt harsh or that felt difficult, sometimes it was the criticism that I prized the most because I knew that the reader had gotten it wrong. You know what I mean? If you receive feedback from 20 people in workshop, probably half of it, maybe even a little more than half of it, you can just throw in the trash can because they don't get what you're going for. Then maybe a quarter, they really get it and they're giving you great advice. And then another quarter might be people that are pushing back in a way that's kind of mean and kind of oppositional, whether you like it or not, that's what it is. And there are clues in that pile, more so than the people who are getting you wrong. There are clues in that pile as to where your argument is weak, where people are seeing what you're doing as malevolent, or they're getting frustrated and upset by something that you're saying. And it can be very revealing. It can possibly be more revealing than, it might be more helpful than the praise. And so that was something that was eye-opening for me, and I think very important to understand, because it's easy to shut down when you get criticism. And it's harder to ask, where is this person coming from? And why are they saying this? And sometimes it's just like, I'm really hitting on an emotional vein. There's something happening here that it's the last thing I'm going to give up now, because I know that it's touching a thread. And ultimately, I define art as something that makes another person feel something. You know what I mean? It's great if it makes them think, but it's very important to me that they have some sort of a visceral emotion from what I have created. And so I think that's good advice for people, is like, don't always trash the stuff that feels like it's being harsh or that they're being oppositional. Ask yourself questions about why they're having that reaction.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about how writing nonfiction, being a memoirist, might cause some anxiety, some hesitancy about telling those stories. You also told me before the interview, you mentioned this idea of how it's important for writers to find ways to stay alive creatively. I'm curious if those things connect, and just to hear you talk about that idea of why it's important to think about ways to stay alive creatively as writers.
I just think that the world beats you down. When I look at my life, I think, well, somebody like me from my background with parents who didn't finish high school and got their GEDs, and, we struggled financially, and there was a lot of racism in the town that I grew up. I wasn't supposed to have a voice. I was not this, there were plenty of people who tried to silence me in my life. And so, what is the sort of, where does the determination and the focus and the sacrifice come from? Because to be a writer, you do sacrifice time with people that you love. It's a very solitary pursuit. You go into your room and you shut your door, and you're not doing things that are engaging or entertaining or fun. You're basically, you're world building on the page in a very private space. And so I think that in particular, the early phases of creation require a lot of creative energy. I think that the revision phases, perhaps less so. But when you're generating the new idea for a new essay, for a new short story, for a new poem, for a new chapter, it has to come from a sort of an internal pressure that is the source. It's a creative source that maybe isn't completely you. You know what I mean? And so I do think that, you need to figure out what it is that feeds you and that makes you feel alive. For some people, that's going to be spending a day on the ski slopes, like I said, or maybe listening to music or doing something. And for other people, it's film or going to an art museum. There can be many ways that you get inspired. Reading is a great way, but it's imperative, because otherwise, without that internal pressure, right, you're just moving words around on the page. There is sort of a mystery in what makes some language kind of have this power to jump off the page and to really move a reader. What's the difference between that and language that is kind of interesting, but it doesn't really do anything? It doesn't really create that spark. I think it's what is generated by the individual who's creating the art. And so, the world will beat you down. You have to find ways to stay alive, or you're not going to create work that feels lively.
And I guess once you find those things that make you feel alive creatively, it's okay to think of that as part of your process, right? I feel like sometimes we can fall into this trap where it's like, all that matters is the time that I'm spending at the page, but there are all these other things that are just as equally important and part of the process.
Oh, I'm completely against the idea that everything happens when you're sitting at your desk or writing. Oh, completely against it. I mean, I feel like a large portion of writing happens away from the desk because you're doing something you enjoy and you're thinking about it. In fact, a lot of times when I get stuck at the desk, I get up and I go out for a run, or I love to take a bath or a shower. And then I'm taking notes, or I'm speaking into my voice memo, and I'm catching the heart, the spirit of the story in sort of a language that, in a cadence that feels more down to earth and natural. The difficulty of kind of weaving in historic threads into a personal arc or a memoir is that a lot of times there's a departure in the language where you suddenly sound more academic as you try to weave in the histories, and figuring out how to say things and get things all on the level of the story. That's a lot of times when you find that many times when you step away from your desk.
Well, I could talk to you for another hour, but we have to wrap up here. So the last question that I ask faculty members when they come on to the show is, having worked with numerous students over the years, what, in your opinion, makes someone a quote unquote successful MFA student, and what pitfalls should our listeners try to avoid?
I think the pitfalls to avoid are comparing yourself with other people, having that moment of envy and kind of bottling up and not praising the work. Remember that as an artist, an artist affirms their love of the art by praising what's good in the art world, so you really have to love story and care about story above everything else. A beautiful story has the power to heal. Words have magic in them. There is a sacredness in this pursuit of storytelling. It can change who you are at the heart of who you are if you tell your story in the right way and you really strike a vein with yourself. It's not just about affecting other people. It's about growing as an individual, Yeah. And then I think that it's important that people realize that there are many avenues to publication. And it's not like everybody needs to have a huge publisher. There are many, many wonderful medium-sized publishers. I could name a ton of them right now. And then there are small presses also. And I've seen some people publish with a really big publisher, and then it kind of, their book doesn't do very well and it kind of messes them up. And I've seen other people start with a smaller press and then kind of go to a medium size. And then, you know what I mean? So your sort of journey along the publishing route doesn't have to look like anybody else's. And it's important that you stay in your own lane. You're a good literary citizen. You praise other people's work. You enjoy what you enjoy. You remember why you got started in this whole thing. And it was because books changed your life. And then, you're going to be just fine. Let the words have some integrity. Don't call them finished until you really know they're finished. Insist on making things better. You can be smarter than you are if you keep trying.
Well, this has been a beautiful conversation, and your memoir, Whiskey Tender, is a beautiful book. By the time this episode comes out, your book will be out in the world. I encourage our listeners to go to their local independent bookstore if possible and buy a copy, or go to deborah.taffa.com and order one there. Deborah, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.